Muchas gracias, Ceci. Muchas gracias a todas y todos por asistir esta tarde a esta charla que va a impartir la curadora de la exposición, Nicole. Nicole, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Como saben, la charla va a ser en inglés. Se les han dado algunos chicharitos de traducción. Y la dinámica, a grandes rasgos, será la siguiente. Va a dar Nicole su charla y al final habrá un breve espacio para poder intercambiar algunas ideas en torno a lo que nos comparta esta tarde Nicole. Me gustaría comentar que la exposición, la cual esta charla está en el contexto de la exposición que inauguramos el día de ayer, la revolución impresionista de Monet a Matisse del Museo de Arte de Dallas, que está actualmente en la Sala Nacional y en la Sala Diego Rivera, que estará hasta el 27 de julio y que, bueno, esperamos que la puedan visitar si es que no lo han hecho. Es una exposición que originalmente se desarrolló en el Museo de Arte de Dallas en el contexto del 150 aniversario de la primera exposición de este movimiento de artistas, los impresionistas, que llevaron a cabo en 1874 y que desde entonces transformarían el arte de manera radical. De esto nos platicará un poco más a profundidad. Voy a leer brevemente la semblanza de Nicole para cederle la palabra. Nicole actualmente es la directora de Curaduría e Investigación y curadora principal de arte europeo en el Museo de Arte de Dallas, en Texas, Estados Unidos. Se ha desempeñado como curadora de pintura y escultura europea del Museo de Arte de Dallas. Previamente fue curadora asociada del Museo de Arte Nelson Atkins en Kansas City, donde organizó exposiciones como Rodin, esculturas de la Fundación Iris y Gerald Cantor y Jerome y el Atractivo de Oriente. Ha comisariado notables exposiciones como Bert Morisot, Woman Impressionist, así como Woman Artists in Europe from the Monarchy to Modernism. Además, ha supervisado diversas adquisiciones para la colección del Museo de Arte de Dallas. También trabajó como investigadora curatorial en el Museo Metropolitano de Nueva York, el Museo de Bellas Artes de Boston y el Museo de San Luis. Se especializa en pintura francesa del siglo XIX y en su tesis doctoral investigó al pintor francés Gustave Courbet. Sin más, Nicole, welcome.
Gracias, thank you so much. It is really an honor for me to be here to open this beautiful exhibition and also to share some extra context and information with you all tonight. You'll forgive me, I hope, for not speaking Spanish. I could do this in French or English. I'm going to stick with English, though. And I want to say a big thank you to Joshua for this beautiful invitation tonight, to Lucia, to Danielle for the incredibly warm welcome that you and all your staff here have shown to me and the team from the DMA, as well as to our incredible translator. If you can't tell, I'm speaking slowly right now in English. That's not my norm. I'm so sorry, and she's amazing. So hopefully we can really deliver to you the story tonight. So thank you for your patience again and for your warm welcome. So the exhibition, as you know, we've titled it The Impressionist Revolution, Monet to Matisse from the Dallas Museum of Art, where you've heard I'm the chief curator and also the curator of this exhibition. The show tells the story, the origins of the Impressionist group of artists, which was a contemporary artist collective, essentially, that came together to mount their own exhibition in 1874. And it traces its legacy into the early 20th century. It's told entirely through our collection at the Dallas Museum of Art. We have exceptional holdings of this material. I'm a very lucky curator. And really, it was our joy to be able to tell such a complete story through what we have in our museum's holdings. If you have not seen the show yet, I hope that you will in the next few months spend time. There are 45 masterworks, real icons of our collection, and they're works by some of the most beloved artists in the history of art. Artists like Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and Vincent van Gogh, among many others. You won't be surprised to hear me say that Impressionism is probably the most recognized kind of art around the world. It's hard to think of another type of art that is so popular today, so beloved, so familiar to so many people, that if I say the word Impressionism, many people will automatically envision paintings like these. Works by Monet of water lilies, you're seeing one of the works in the exhibition there on the left, or perhaps ballet dancers by Edgar Degas. Americans in particular love Impressionism. I don't know if it's the same here, but we are absolutely obsessed. So much so that it actually forms the backbone of most top-tier museum collections like ours. And we start this appreciation really, really young. We include it in popular culture, so it will be seen, of course, in the backdrop of movies like this. I don't know if this was popular here in Mexico. I'm aging myself. But in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there you see a still from the 80s on the left. And on the Titanic, when Rose wanted Jack to paint her like one of his French girls, it turns out that he had a lot of inspiration. If you're a nerd like me and you look very closely, you'll see, in fact, that Rose was a collector and she was ahead of her time. She was avant-garde. She had works by Picasso, by Monet, some water lilies, and by Degas, Little Dancer. And just when we thought that Monet couldn't get any hotter, Rene Russo and Pierce Brosnan steamed it up in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where they filmed the Thomas Crown Affair. That was from the late 90s. Ooh la la. Impressionism really is one of the rare instances where modern art has made the leap from the high art world of museums to the so-called low art world of pop culture and commercial retail. As I said, we can't seem to get enough of them. I am no different. We reproduce their images everywhere. Most of us probably grew up with some kind of impressionist art reproduced on something in our homes, from soap wrappers and boxes of candies and mints, to even putting Renoir on our cookie tins, maybe our calendars. I did, taking them to school with us and postering them in our rooms, maybe as children, maybe now as adults. And in today's culture of open access images and companies on the web like Zazzle, our options are truly endless. We can go to bed with Caillebotte, or we can watch the sunrise with Monet from the comfort of our own couch. Seeing paintings like Monet's Impression Sunrise, the painting that coined the term Impressionism when it was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, presented there in that image in such a calm and soothing interior is really quite remarkable. It gives the impression, all puns intended, that this kind of artwork was always in high demand, that it was always appreciated for its atmospheric effects, that its softly moody tones were always seen as picturesque, and that it was beautiful enough to invite into the most intimate spaces of our homes. And yet, that actually could not be further from the truth. Although we use the term impressionist now to loosely describe the aesthetic of short brushwork applied rapidly to the canvas in bright hues, Impressionism, as it emerged in the 1870s, it wasn't a style. Rather, it was a collective of cutting-edge contemporary artists who banded together under a common cause to find a way to support themselves outside the conservative, state-run fine arts system, because there was almost no support for their radical approach to making art, not in the press and not with mainstream collectors. In fact, it was their rejection from the government's official salon or exhibition system, the only public venue for the display of artwork in the 19th century in France, essentially the only way to get the press to see your work, to appear in print and reviews, and thus to attract clientele, to find collectors. You could only do this once a year at the government's state-run salon exhibition. It was basically juried by very conservative artists that were not so excited about new modern movements in art. And most of these young artists were rejected quite frequently, which meant they had to wait an entire year to try again, to find a way to establish themselves, to make a career, to sell their artwork. This was a really difficult system, and it was their rejection from the Salon that drove them to organize their first group show in 1874 in Paris. And they were following a model that sort of existed by some of their art history heroes, like Gustave Courbet and Edouard Manet. They had mounted sort of solo exhibitions of their own work in pavilions in the World's Fair in Paris. But there had never been a group show before that was really unique and special. So this was something that is unique to these artists. To say that the artwork exhibited by the founding members of the group, which included Monet, Cézanne, Renoir, Degas, Sisley, Pissarro, and Morisot, utterly shocked the public is an understatement. So I'm showing you here a caricature that was produced by an artist named Cham, who was pretty funny, on the occasion of the first Impressionist exhibition. And if you look at the caption, either in French or in English, it's interesting because it doesn't just allude to the French Revolution, but actually to the Reign of Terror, which was the most violent and destructive phase of the French Revolution. That was the new regime that was just basically bent on destroying all the vestiges of tradition. So it was very deliberate. It's why I put the word revolution in the title of the show, because it carried a lot of weight even then. And we bring our own connotations to it today. In fact, the name Impressionism, which the group eventually accepted a few years later, was given to them as an insult in 1874 by the French critic Louis Leroy in response, again, to the very now iconic Impression Sunrise that you're seeing there on the left by Monet. And Monet titles it Impression Sunrise, so he starts it in a way. And Leroy will say, "Impression? I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what example of workmanship, wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." It's a 19th century burn for you. Over the course of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, which were organized between 1874 and 1886, critics and the public alike were utterly stunned again by this very challenging, very difficult contemporary art that was on display. Some of the most common criticisms that were thrown at the group were that their paintings were garishly colored and horrifyingly ugly. It's like the opposite, of course, I think, of how most of us see these today. And so there are hundreds of caricatures like the one there on the left that came out at the time that really try to capture that sense that these are so ugly and scary that you could use them in war, to scare away your opponents, essentially. So this one there on the left was produced on the occasion of the 3rd Impressionist exhibition in 1877, where Renoir debuted his ball at the Moulin de la Galette. You saw it earlier on a cookie tin. It was really sharply satired that what we see again is so charming and French and beautiful was seen as actually ugly and garish. Reviewing that show, one critic scoffed, "The majority of the time, they are awkward attempts, crude in color and tone, without contour, without modeling, displaying the most complete disregard for drawing, distances, and perspective. Colors chucked, so to speak, at random, placed next to each other in flat tints with no blending. The search most often for the grotesque and the ugly to undoubtedly produce an impression of astonishment and surprise on the spectator, hence perhaps the name they've given themselves of Impressionism." Of course, as you just heard, they didn't give that to themselves, but it stuck, and they eventually accepted it. It can be really hard for us to understand why these paintings, again, that we find so appealing today, were seen as grotesque. But much of it had to do with these bright pastel hues that the artist adopted to convey the optical sensation of light moving in nature, in order to represent nature not as we know it, but as we perceive it as humans in the world. The Impressionists turned their back on the Renaissance tradition of muted, naturalistic earth tones, as well as the depiction of shadows or even volumetric depth using shades of black, you'll notice they almost entirely eliminate black from their palette. Instead, they'll depict shading, volume, dark tones with dark blues, dark purples, dark greens, things that we really do see in nature. As they like to say, the only real time you see black in nature is if you're looking at a piece of coal or charcoal. That color doesn't really exist. It's all the colors, all at once. And so that's kind of at the heart of what they were doing. Renoir's application of this technique caused an absolute scandal at the Second Impressionist show in 1876 when he exhibited that beauty there in the middle. And it wasn't just the style, but it was the time-honored genre of the nude, which was at the very top of a hierarchy in the French Academy as being the height of what artists could achieve through the human form. So he exhibited that female nude. He called it a study. I think he knew people would already be pretty upset about it. Study torso, effective sun, to give some sense that it's an impression. So a critic writing in one of the newspapers raved, "Would someone kindly explain to Monsieur Renoir that a woman's torso is not a mass of decomposing flesh with green and purple blotches that indicate a state of complete putrefaction of the corpse?" I mean, could you imagine being the artist? And here's this critic saying, tell this guy that this is not a dead body. That's how they saw this, and for good reason. And then another caricature that you see by Cham plays that up in this caricature from the next year's show, playing again on the idea, but these are the tones of cadavers? Yes, but unfortunately I've not been able to capture the smell. And then the one on the right that you see too, this really was kind of a trend then of them talking about these being, dead bodies essentially as models. And there the caption reads, "Madam, for your portrait, there are a few tones missing on your face. You couldn't have spent a few days at the bottom of a river beforehand?" Ouch, right? Still another critic reviewing the third Impressionist exhibition compared the overwhelming palette of blues and greens that he saw upon entering the room to Roquefort blue cheese. I love that. You have to love the French, right? They're going to compare it to blue cheese. A frequent complaint was that the artists were too blue or too violet because, again, they were using these colors instead of black or dark browns to convey shadow and space. And the artist Gustave Caillebotte really got the brunt of it. You can see that was one of his preferred tones in the two pictures I'm showing you here on the screen. Another critic, again, sort of said that Caillebotte was essentially creating a symphony in blue. He says that Monsieur Caillebotte executed better than anyone else. Everything is blue. What he spends on cobalt, ultramarine, and indigo is frightening to think. So he's naming all these blue pigments to kind of make the point. And another one writes that Monsieur Caillebotte seems haunted by blue and violet, in which his paintings are a little too saturated. Even the most seemingly innocent subjects, often favorites Degas' Little Dancers, you see his sculpture there that he shows in 1882 at the fourth show, it absolutely reviled the reviewers, the public, and the critics. One of them writes, "I don't ask that art should always be elegant, but I don't believe that its role is to champion the cause of ugliness." The diminutive figure, which was the only sculpture that Degas would exhibit publicly, was described variously as repulsive, as vicious, and as a threat to society. The latter has as much to do with the social class of the subject. The dancers were lower class, working class girls who were trained to dance in the Paris Opera. The ballet was the musical interlude. So that was part of it. But it was also the unidealized features that Degas will give to his figures, not just in sculpture, in paintings as well. This is a period in which Darwin's theories on evolution and on facial features and even sort of phrenology, kind of studying the shape of face, they believed, as a science would tell you, if someone was a criminal, if they were good, if they were moral, if they were bad. We don't see that today, but these unidealized features, the way she sticks her chins out, it really invoked a lot of fear. That's where that threat to society comes from, that you're taking a social class and you're elevating to the status. And that was really terrifying for a lot of people seeing this. Again, because it's being presented to the public as high art, as fine art. So that, of course, there's satires that this kind of art was really a perversion of French values that was a danger to public health. So in the caricature you're seeing there on the left, this very pregnant woman is being told, don't go in there, it's a risk to your child. It's that terrible what's on the walls and the effect that it can have. But overall, the most frequent criticism that these artists in the Impressionist group got, whether it was positive, whether it was negative, was that they were incapable of making a finished picture. So another writer reviewing the 1877 show, where Monet debuted his Gare Saint-Lazare series, you're seeing one of those there on the left, really captured the critical zeitgeist of the time. And it's a long quote. You can tell that I love reading the words of these critics at the time, so I hope you'll bear with me. But it really illustrates, better than I can, what it was that was so challenging, what they saw in these paintings that I think, unfortunately, we're quite blind to because we just think they're so amazing. This critic says, "The Impressionists are painters who have the audacity to give us a glimpse, a simple impression of things without making the effort to enter into the detailed study of line, color, or the 1,000 other knowing combinations that painters of the past had the good nature to be concerned with. A self-respecting impressionist does not put on these airs and graces. He proceeds by the abrupt application of color. He takes his brush and forcefully dabs the canvas. Something shocking results from this process that stuns the viewer and that our imagination is responsible for completing. It's not that there aren't certain qualities in some of the works exhibited by the Impressionists, but they are qualities of a very rudimentary nature. All of them made sketches, not one of them made a picture." That sums it up right there. Okay, so where are they getting this from, right? You go in the exhibition, you see all these pictures. I can keep telling you that it's radical, it's innovative, it's revolutionary. But if we don't actually look at what was popular, at what the government was commissioning, at what clients were told they should be spending their money on, it doesn't really help, does it? So we're gonna take a step even further back into the past and really look at what it was that the artists were rebelling against and what was expected of them. Because you're understanding the stakes are quite high, right? But so what are we comparing it to? So we're gonna take a look now at the academic system, and really I hope will help give that extra context that if you don't study 19th century art history like me, is not a story that most people know. So as I mentioned earlier, until the Impressionist show in 1874, the only public exhibition where you as an artist could show your work in Paris was at the Salon. It was a subset of the Academy of Fine Arts, which again was administered by the French government. That's where you would study and learn to become an artist, a painter, a sculptor, an engraver, what have you. In the Academy of Fine Arts, they had a hierarchy of media and also of genres or subjects. So painting was at the very top, then sculpture, then decorative arts, and so on. And within painting, at the very top was history painting, which were pictures that took their subjects from history, from Greek and Roman mythology, from the Bible, religious stories, personas, and they focused on the human figure because the body also is thought to be the most difficult to paint, to create that sense of movement and realism, and to create a mythological story. We're seeing one there on the right by the artist David in the 18th century, to be able to know how to compose a picture, to tell a story without words. This was a skill, and they taught that in the sense that you became a historian, and that idea that you use your intellect to figure out how to communicate complex message without words at all in these history paintings. So this is at the very top, then anything else with a human figure, like portraits, then you have landscape, then you have still life, pretty much at the very bottom. By the time you get to still life, artists weren't thought to have much talent. You're just mimicking, copying what nature put in front of you, not using your intellect to create a composition and tell a story. So public display of artwork at the Salon, and you're seeing there an engraving in the 18th century, and if you look very, very closely, you'll see that David painting on the right, engraved and captured on the back wall. They would be shown to the public at the Salon with the intent, in fact, not to be commercial. You're supposed to separate commerce from fine art. It was a very important divide. The works might have been for sale, but this wasn't supposed to be that kind of exhibition. The goal was to educate the public. It was to uplift their morals through those important subjects. And so again, it was all very controlled in terms of this is what the culture, what the government wanted people to learn, to see, to aspire to, really what the purpose of that was. So again, this is the Salon of 1785, stepping really back far into time. The painting by David was acquired by the state. You can see it at the Louvre today in one of their grand galleries, because if you did well, the government would buy your artwork and it would enter into the royal collection, and there it would stay. So that was the really great honor that you could possibly have. In the salon itself, there was a gallery of honor. I feel like I'm sitting in the gallery of honor right now, where you would find the state commissions and works that were already intended to be acquired, receive awards, be celebrated. And just like today, everything is about location, location, location. So if you were hung at the very top, pretty much no one could see your art. They said that it was skied, was the term, literally to the sky. Nobody could see it if it's way at the top. The real place is to be on the sight line. So even if you got into the salon, if they skied you, critics don't see it, collectors don't see it. It's like almost like it didn't happen. So these were really lofty ambitions to uphold, and to keep that in order, a jury was appointed by the French Academy. They were usually academicians. They taught at the School of Fine Arts, so more often than not, very conservative values that the state was putting forward in terms of tradition and artwork. And they were expected to uphold these hierarchy of genres, and it extended into the styles and to the finish of the pictures as well. So what's crazy about it is that the people appointed to be jurors weren't always artists. So there's a caricature there on the left where you see that some of the people appointed to make this determination were mathematicians with the compass. Some of them were, astronomers, looking at the stars. A very fair system, as you can see. And there on the right, a painting from the 19th century that shows actually the jury as they're going through and making these quick judgments when artists submit their pictures, and whether they're going to be in or out. So over the years, the rules changed, as did the composition of the jury. Reforms were made all throughout the 19th century to be a little bit more accepting of different styles of modernisms. You didn't always have to be a member of the Academy anymore to submit your artwork. That changed. It opened up a bit more. There were some concessions to style, trying to keep the public interested and engaged as tastes change. But even still, in general, what was championed by the Academy and reflected in the salon and the state purchases were history paintings. As I mentioned, biblical, mythological, or maybe sometimes even more recent events in history. That was kind of a newer thing in the 19th century. Stories that were sort of ripped from the headlines, if you will, were acceptable now if it had that educational, uplifting story. So I'm showing you actually a selection of works that were accepted to the salon in the 1870s, at the same time that our young artists like Monet and Renoir and Degas and Morisot are painting their cadavers, essentially. But here you see what's expected of the style. It's much more what we would call photorealistic. The idea that the artist really works to eliminate the trace of their hands. It almost has kind of like a machine finish that I think I admire today when I look at them, that kind of magic of how do they do that? How do they conjure this image? Very different, of course, than what the Impressionists will do. But you were expected to do that. You see the earth tones, very dark, green, brown, lots of black, bit muddy, if you will. And also a lot of attention given to perspectival illusionism, to volumetric modeling, and again, this naturalistic palette. So this is what's being accepted to the salon and being purchased by the government and shown to the public. That's what a nude should look like. Here we have recent history with Napoleon on horseback. So just gives you a little bit of a sense. And also, I can't help myself, sidebar, the Jerome you see there in the bottom right, that was the inspiration for Ridley Scott for Gladiator 1, and also the second Gladiator movie that just came out. That looks familiar to you. Filmmakers today are still looking to 19th century painting for sets, for ideas, for design. Landscape, as you heard, was kind of a lower genre, but it was rising in popularity in spite of everything the Academy was trying to do. And so they realized to kind of keep, again, the public engaged, that they had to kind of loosen up a little bit their standards. So for landscape painters like Corot that you're seeing there in Daubigny, it was expected that you could have a little bit of a looser brushstroke, so that it feels a bit more like nature. That was okay. But you'll see the composition is still very much crafted. These were painted in a studio. And the earth tones, very brown, very green, very naturalistic in many ways. So if you're an artist, once a year, you submit your paintings to the jury at the salon. If you were rejected, as you see there in the caricature on the left, it was absolutely devastating. So you see this poor artist who is following his paintings out as though they are dead bodies, essentially being carried out, having been rejected, or even worse, a caricature by Daumier there on the right, of an artist who says, if it's not good enough for them, no one can have it, and is throwing a sculpture through the painting, because the stakes were high. How are you going to make a living? If you were accepted, you had your painting hung. Artists had no power. It got hung in different places. And the final step was actually to varnish your picture in situ in the salon, essentially as that last step. So varnish is a very shiny resin. This is something that the Impressionists will completely reject, but that was the sign of a finished picture. And the coating can be, again, very slick, very shiny. It creates that mirror-like surface. And what's interesting in French is that the word for opening for an exhibition is vernissage. It's varnishing day. It's the day you varnish your picture. It's done, it's ready for the public to see. As I mentioned, if you did well, you could get awards, you would gain prestige, you would get commissions and patrons, you were written about in the papers, hopefully in a more positive way than our friends the Impressionists were. It really was the marker of professional success. If you were going to establish a studio, this is how you garnered a name for yourself. It was a critical step in any artist really trying to make a name for themselves, for just about every artist in France. And they had international sections of the show too, so Mexican artists, American artists, German artists. It wasn't just in France, this sign of total prestige to be accepted, to show your work there, and how that really started you on your career. Almost every artist in the 19th century wanted to achieve this recognition and success and validation at the salon, and our friends the Impressionists really were no different. Almost all of them submitted to the salon one way or the other leading up to that first show in 1874. Edgar Degas, Berthe Morisot, they actually did pretty well. They were rarely rejected, in fact. They were the first ones to kind of turn their backs on the salon and only exhibit with the Impressionists from 1874 forward. But for them, they both came from money. And it wasn't financially necessary for either one of them to get that kind of public prestige and clientele because they had their own money. They could afford to be a bit more avant-garde and experimental. That was not the case for most of their colleagues and friends who they showed with later. Cézanne, you're seeing one of his submissions there on the left. I can't help but laugh. I think it's still challenging and hard to understand Cézanne today. Poor Cézanne, he tried 4 times to have his works accepted at the Salon, and he was always rejected. Whereas Caillebotte there in the middle, with one of his most famous paintings that you can see usually in Paris today at the Musée d'Orsay, he tried just once with that famous painting in 1875, and it was promptly rejected from the Salon. So he would end up debuting that painting the next year with the Impressionists, and he never looked back. So he only exhibited with the Impressionists. He, like Degas and Morisot, also had his own money, so he could be a little bit more fluid with that. And for her part, Mary Cassatt, a painting that she submitted to the Salon you're seeing there on the right, she had no intention at all of joining the Impressionist group. She had all of her submissions to the Salon accepted every year from 1868 to 1876. That was the year of the second Impressionist show. So I'm showing you here a work accepted from 1874, again, when these other rebel artists were doing their own thing. That's what she showed at the Salon that year. It was only in 1877, when for the first time all of her submissions were rejected from the Salon, that she finally accepted the invitation from her friend Degas to show with this other group. So she probably would have kept going at the Salon. And what's amazing is if you think about how she's famous today, how we know her work, and I regret that we don't have her in this show here in Mexico City. She's known for her very impressionistic images of mothers and children. Looks nothing like this. I think it was a smart decision. I think she was better as an impressionist. But for the most part, for most of the Impressionists, it was a bit of a mixed bag, and it can be really difficult to kind of see why. Some years they had some things accepted, and other years they weren't. So you see here Renoir with a work, one of which was accepted one year and one of which was rejected, even though they look in many ways the same, I think, to our eyes today. So it was kind of a mixed bag. Monet had the same thing. You see a work there that was accepted to the Salon, and literally just, a year or two later, the work on the right there was rejected. It's huge, very bright, very different in style, so maybe it's a bit more evident why his landscape on the left was a bit more acceptable, and where he started really kind of leaving that behind and getting a bit more modern in his subject and application of paint. That was a step too far, and they said, absolutely not. But it has to be noted that in 1867, it was just a really bad year for most artists. Most of the young, avant-garde, up-and-coming painters were rejected categorically. It was a very strict, very conservative jury that year. And it really started galvanizing these artists to be creative and to think about, well, what are we going to do? Because if it stays like this, we're not going anywhere. So the Salon of 1874, it opened in the spring. And these are the two works that received the highest awards from the French state. So there again is our friend Jerome with a historical drama piece of Molière that everybody wants to see, I know. And he's known for his mirror-like finish, high polish, a little bit stuffy, historical revival. And then this kind of really wild, mythological, crazy, large history painting of a satyr's family. I mean, this is what, again, received the highest gold medals at the Salon from the government. And on the other side of Paris, you're going to see something really different. I got ahead of myself, though. I will say that it's not to say that the avant-garde artists were all completely rejected, again, from the Salon. By 1873, Edouard Manet, you'll see one of his paintings in the show. He was a mentor to this group. He was not really shocking anymore. He made his scandals in 1864, 1865, so paintings like the one on the left were actually accepted to the Salon. It wasn't so shocking anymore, even though the subject is really quite modern, of a young woman and her charge, kind of looking out over the steam coming from railroad track, essentially, and business on the street. Or Fantin Latour, you see there, an avant-garde artist who kind of towed the line in between adopting a brighter palette, but it's a more traditional way of painting, and a bit of nod to classical, statuary there in the back to kind of round it out. So the Salon was not black and white. There was always some wiggle room. But again, if we're looking at these at the Salon of 74 and these, now we're going to go to the other part of Paris. We're going to skip forward. Now I'm going to bring you back to that first show of the Impressionists, where we started. Now you've got all that context and some other images in your mind. And if we go back to that first Impressionist exhibition, I'm showing you two of Monet's submissions to that show. I hope now you can really imagine what it would have felt like walking into Nadar's studio, which these artists rented. He was a photographer, on the Boulevard de Capucines. So it's actually the view from Nadar's studio that Monet will paint when he goes to scout out the location. He likes it, he says, we'll take it, and then he paints the view from the window looking down onto the street. So you would have passed that view, gone up into the space, and then seen that as one of the paintings in the show. But when you look at these two together, you can really start to understand that people were confused, that they did not have the vocabulary, the visual education to even understand what they were looking at. They didn't get it. So that's where our friend, the critic Louis Leroy, will derogatorily call them Impressionists, because it's nothing. What are you looking at? Or of the Boulevard de Capucines that you're seeing there on the right, he calls them cat lickings, little lickings of a cat. Like, could not think of even how to describe these flicks of paint that to us read as the movement and the swirls of people on the boulevards. It's still actually very difficult to identify all the things that you see on the street, because that wasn't the point. You weren't supposed to recognize everything. Just like when you walk down the boulevard just outside the museum here, your eye captures all kinds of things, and you don't think about all these detail. It's just the sensation, it's the experience. Also on view at the first Impressionist exhibition are these very bright and airy springtime scenes by Camille Pissarro and Alfred Sisley in a rainbow of colors that are anything but earth-toned. They are not slick and polished or mirror-like in application. You can see every touch of the artist's brushwork, every brushstroke, every color that they put on. And that real matte surface you see, those pastel colors, no varnish, which saturates, which makes glossy, makes darker. That's what they did to signify a difference, a break with tradition. And also why the critics said these aren't finished pictures. It's lacking that detail. Cézanne at the first Impressionist exhibition showed a version of his Olympia, you're seeing there on the right. He gets shredded by the critics at the Impressionist show too. Poor Cézanne, so misunderstood. One critic says, Monsieur Cézanne can only be seen now as some crazy person agitated by delirium tremens while painting. Ouch. And then someone else says of him, of all the known juries, none have ever, even while dreaming, entertained the possibility of accepting any painting by this painter who showed up himself to the salon, carrying his paintings on his back like Jesus Christ did the cross. A too exclusive love for yellow has, until now, compromised the future of Monsieur Cézanne. You know, of course, today we love his still lifes of apples that have yellows all across the board. But wow, rough. It's not to say that all the artists showing with the Impressionists were universally panned the way that Cézanne was, sadly for him. He stopped showing with the group. He retreats back to Aix-en-Provence and just kind of hides for a very long time. No one really knows what he's up to because he pretty much had enough, I think, in Paris. Can't say I blame him for that. So many of the artists had their highs and lows. Basically, Renoir, Degas, and Bert Morisot were generally considered to be the most talented artists in the group, really from the beginning. And it's sort of not a surprise when we look at Degas, another wonderful work there, an oil painting on the left, because I see him more as a draftsman than as a painter. He loved to work in the pastel medium. He loved to make prints, and even when he's doing painting, there's a very linear quality. He's a draftsman, even in paint, and that was valued by the Academy, by the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts. For him, though, where the criticism came from, as you saw a little bit earlier, was how he depicted social class, who he chose to depict in the pictures, and these were subjects that often disturbed people, so that if you look very closely at his lovely scenes of dancers, whether they're rehearsing or from maybe a box, a loge, looking onto the stage as you are there on the left, you can usually see the figure of a man in a top hat who's of a higher social class and was likely to have been a patron, a special friend and patron to one of these teenage girls, and help them make the ends meet, let's put it that way. So there's a lot socially happening in these pictures that we are invisible, that we just can't see today, that we're blind to. I'm sorry, I ruined Degas for everyone. I'm sorry if I ruined him for you tonight, but these are not, sadly, the sweetest little dancers. Well, they might have been sweet, in fact, but it was a tough life. And he didn't shy away from depicting that, and that made people uncomfortable. So they are okay with the style, but very uncomfortable with what he's capturing, which is the reality and fact of entertainment in Paris in this moment, and the real rift that we still see today, right, in societies between those who don't have as many choices and those who have the money and freedom, maybe to act how they might like. And on the right there with the Renoir, viewers were also troubled by the appearance. A lot of these social codes, again, are invisible to us. You really had to have been French in the 19th century to pick up on cues of makeup, of fashion and costume that tells a story that we can't see today. So there are critics who like the painting overall, but they had a lot of questions about who this woman was. They were really concerned that she was not a respectably married sort of lady, if you will, in society. Maybe she was a fashion victim, cared too much about superficial qualities. She was basically described as being overly dressed, and excessively made up, because makeup wasn't for fine ladies, from polite backgrounds. That was for a different kind of lady. So there were a lot of questions, even in something like this that we look at today, and we think, how wonderful, how beautiful. And even if they're wearing a wedding ring, there's questions about usually women's status and exactly what kind of women they were. Morizot was an interesting case and a study of the role played by gender in art criticism. So while her male peers were absolutely shredded, trashed, denigrated in the press for their sketch-like paintings, they were often attacked for having no talent at all or a very disturbed vision of the world, and that they lacked the intellectual ability to create a finished picture. Morizot was celebrated for this exact same quality in her works. So we have that beautiful marine there on the right in the exhibition here, and you can see really how she pushes that sketch aesthetic really to a limit in a way that none of her male colleagues would do. So it was a bit of a backhanded compliment, as we say in English, in the sense that they would celebrate her for being so spontaneous, for having this freedom in her painting. But it was actually thought that, in fact, this was okay for a woman, that women didn't have the intellectual capacity to do any better than this, and that she was copying, imitating, mimicking nature, because that's what women can do, and that the men had no excuse, because they should have had the intellectual ability to take that sketch and to make something more finished. So it's complicated, right? That the women are allowed, plus ça change, more things change. So she's kind of an interesting one, because she was literally, by the second show, considered to be a leader of the group, one of the most talented, and yet you might have thought to yourself, why have I not heard of her before? Founding member, the Impressionist, showed in more exhibitions than Monet, than Renoir, than all the artists except Pissarro. And essentially, sadly, she gets written out of art history in the 20th century, even though she was praised by the press throughout all those exhibitions for her talent. So I'll say, at least to read some nice criticism for the once about Morizot, there's one artist, or one critic at least, that says, the truth is that if there is a single impressionist in the group, it's Berthe Morizot. Her painting has all the freshness of improvisation. Here is where we really find the impression perceived by a sincere eye, faithfully rendered by a hand that does not lie. If only they meant it in the most positive way possible. So I am keeping my eye on the time, and I want to leave time for Q&A. But all of that is a perfect seg to our show. So I'm going to quickly zip through just a couple of the images that you will get to spend the next 3 months with, really, truly, to just, again, bring it back, not just what the Impressionists were doing, but how you'll see that in this exhibition. So the first segment, introducing you to these rebels and introducing modern subjects that we see as picturesque, but were considered to be inappropriate for oil painting, for fine art, for public display, and certainly seen as sketches and not finished pictures. So two are our masterworks, some of my favorites by Monet and by Pissarro. A sort of subspecialty of many of the Impressionists was still life painting, using that as a pretext for formal experimentation. They really pushed the envelope in terms of how they're tackling space, the decorative aspect of painting, and some of the breakthroughs that artists like Cézanne will make lead to Cubism in the 20th century and some of the other modernisms. The second thematic section of the show looks at innovative approaches to paintings, going outside for the landscape painters, painting directly before the motif. They adopted light-colored preparatory grounds instead of the dark brown that was where you started a painting, as taught by the Academy, to increase the vibrancy, to really produce that optical sensation of light. They took their colors pure from what was a new invention, the collapsible metal paint tube, which is more affordable, mass-produced, kept better, put it in your backpack, take the train, new technology, went even further into the countryside, to the coast, more affordable. That's what the artists do. So you have Monet, who is our itinerant landscape painter. They leave Paris, they go to the coast, they go to the south, they travel even further afield, to Italy, for example. This is something that you couldn't do before the Industrial Revolution. As someone who was middle class, he was at times not literally able to buy bread, but you could do this. There was a real democratization in this moment for transportation and for people to become painters as amateurs and maybe also as professionals. So you'll explore that in the exhibition. You'll take a look at what happens at the last Impressionist show in 1886 when Seurat and his one follower, Signac, will take what was intuitive with the Impressionists to take pure color and divide it up and apply it spontaneously on the canvas, make it into a science by applying bright colors and tiny dots. And you're gonna see the backlash. What happens when Seurat unveils pointillism in 1886? It caused a real crisis in the group. They felt that maybe they had missed the mark, that the art had become too objective, too much about the objective world around and not about the artist's feelings, thoughts, ideas. So you have an artist like Gauguin who's absolutely essential to the story. He was an Impressionist. He showed in 5 out of the 8 shows, but he will lead a charge of younger artists, still valuing what the Impressionists did, painting things he saw in nature, going outside, but exaggerating color, line, and form to say something more symbolic, more personal about the artwork. In his circle is also Vincent van Gogh, who actually described himself as an Impressionist, which I think I still really love reading his words about that, painting directly en plein air before the motif, but choosing subjects that had deep personal significance to him. So it's kind of a hybrid, if you will. Not long after Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin died, sort of at the turn of the 20th century, huge retrospectives of their artwork were being mounted in Paris, in Amsterdam, in cities in Germany and Vienna, and you get new artists, younger artists, seeing what they're doing with color and line and expression and developing that into new modernism. So you get artists like Henri Matisse and Derain, that you see there on the left, developing something out of pointillism that they will be called the fauves, the wild beasts, by mean press, is what the press does initially at least. And even in Norway, the young Munch, who did not go to Paris to see this, but the art came closer to him, really responding to Gauguin and Van Gogh. You get artists like Kirchner in Germany, who again sees exhibitions of artwork by Van Gogh, by Gauguin, takes those colors and that expressive brushwork, still based in nature, and doing something more, trying to communicate more. And finally, ending with Matisse, since we have gone literally from Monet to Matisse in about 50 minutes or so, still responding to what the Impressionists were doing with still life. Matisse was someone who loved that genre, will paint it his entire career as a modern artist, in dialogue with Cézanne, 40, 50 years after Cézanne will debut with that group. So I'll leave you with that closing thought, that it was a revolution, that Impressionism didn't stop in 1900, even if many of its members sadly did not live to 1900 or after. We still feel the effects of what they did, from literally group exhibitions where we sell tickets and public comes to see, contemporary artist collectives who come together to mount their own show because there's no interest among collectors or the press. Even seeing everyday subjects, we take it for granted that that was not considered to be high art. It all starts in 1874. It was only 150 years ago, but it's still very much relevant today. So I hope you will take all that information with you and keep that in the back of your heads, because I guarantee you when you see the Monet water lilies, you'll forget everything I said, because I do too, and you'll be like, wow, it's amazing, it's beautiful, it's everything, you know, but try if you can to remember how revolutionary it was, but it still is. Thank you.
Gobierno de México.